I'd now like to invite Harry Fisher to the floor. Goodbye. Thanks, Jeff. Harry works with Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, and there is a raft of information that they have about the global market, which I believe those in the audience today will find very interesting. Thank you, Harry.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. As Lynette said, I'm from Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. We're primarily a research and consultancy organization focused on the lithium-ion battery supply chain and increasingly the broader energy transition. So anything kind of market-related within this space, we cover. So all the way from upstream, lithium, nickel, cobalt, all the way through midstream, downstream into batteries and the end users. So today I'll take you through kind of how we're seeing kind of the more global market, just to set the scene for the rest of the day. I think a lot of the topics that have already been discussed today I'll probably touch on. And then towards the end, I'll give a bit more detail on kind of where some of the opportunities are for Australia. And as I said, I think some of those issues have already been raised today. So just a quick overview of who we are, what we do. This is just a range of our services, as I said, ranging from price assessments, research, consultancy, sustainability services, anything within the space we touch on, and there's some more detail on the slide. If you'd like any more information about what we do and how we can help, then please come and grab me at lunch, and I'll be happy to chat that through. So today I'll provide some global context to the battery revolution, as we like to call it, then go into a bit on policy and how that's shaping the market. There was a question about the IRA earlier on, so I can touch on that, and then I'll finish off with some of the opportunities for Australia at the end. So I always like to show this one because I think it really nicely shows where we're at and how we're going. And this chart looks great, doesn't it? Because you see that big kick up in demand in 2020 during COVID. There was a lot of green stimulus from governments all over the world to try and get the economy going again. We saw a particular increase in EV adoption during that period, a big push from the car companies to increase their electric fleets and transition away from internal combustion engines. But when you look at it kind of on a global level, I'm not sure what's happened with some of the editing, but anyway, you can see that we've really barely begun, because that's 2018 to 2023, and then that's where we're going ahead. So we've barely even started. And that just shows the level of opportunity that we need to see in these markets, but also what still needs to be done. And there is a lot to be done. And as you can see there, that most of that demand growth is from the electric vehicle industry, of course, but also maybe towards the back end of the forecast, more from energy storage, and we touched on that just now in the panel discussion. And now we've gone past the gigawatt hour era, and now we're into the terawatt hours, and that's where the numbers start getting really big. But as the last slide showed, you can still see the amount of growth that still needs to come from the sector. And as I said, most of that is driven by EV adoption. This is our latest forecast in the long term. You can see kind of now we're at kind of 15-17% adoption of EV sales globally, but that's got a long way to rise in our base case, and in our high case it could go even higher. But that's really what's pulling lithium-ion battery demand upwards, and that's what the industry needs to kind of move around to support that level of demand. And globally, this is kind of changing the way in which governments think geopolitically about their supply chains, about how they get access to the material. You can see the US is kind of aiming for about 1 in 3 vehicles on the road being electric. Europe, it could be 1 in 2, and in China, it's probably more like 2/3 of the overall market. And they're the 3 major automotive markets that will drive the majority of demand, and that's where the supply chains are really revolving around. You see some of those kind of major car companies on there changing their strategy to move away from internal combustion engines, and how they can ensure that they've got access to enough raw materials and midstream capability to source those targets, both at a government level and a car company level. And on the left, you can see the major battery producers there currently, and China is a long way ahead, but companies such as the US, countries in Europe, Korea, Japan, are positioning themselves to take advantage of some of these opportunities and support their domestic car companies. And now this is some new analysis that we've done at Benchmark just to really map out what's already been committed in terms of the outlook for the full supply chain. So on the left, the upstream, lithium, nickel, etc., all the way through the midstream to the downstream batteries. So that's what's already been committed in terms of CapEx. But this is how much is outstanding. So there's a huge amount of investment still required. As you can see, most of that is in the upstream end of the supply chain. But more than 200, and that's US dollars, not Australian dollars, 200 billion US dollar requirement still to get where we need to be in 2030. And as we saw in the previous slide, that gets even greater by 2040. So there's still a lot of work to do. And as I said, most of that is in the upstream to get those critical raw materials available and in the right form to serve the downstream. And this is something that we like highlighting at Benchmark as well. The bottom is the thing to focus on, is the development stage of each part of the supply chain. You can see on the right, the development of the downstream capacity is much quicker. It can react much more quickly to what's coming from the upstream, particularly in China and South Korea, for example. But it's the upstream, it's the development of those mining assets from exploration through development to getting a raw material product that can then be processed through to battery material. That's the bit that takes time, and it's probably more like 25 years, not 5 years. But you can see that the level of difference between the upstream and the downstream, and that's kind of what we see as the main issue for these supply chains at Benchmark is getting enough of that raw material capacity to serve downstream demand. So that hopefully kind of gives us a bit of more of a global context of where the market's going. And now I'll talk about the importance of policy. I touched on geopolitics earlier on, and this is a theme that's really developed quite substantially in the last year or two, with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which you may have heard of, and also the Critical Raw Materials Act in Europe. So there are two major battery markets, big automotive markets, that those policies are shaping the way in which global supply chains have laid out, but really primarily ensuring that their economies are set up to take advantage of this opportunity. But it does provide significant levels of opportunity for countries such as Australia, Canada, and I'll talk through a little bit more of that now. So there's a lot of detail on this slide, so I won't go through all of it, but effectively the Inflation Reduction Act in the US was announced August last year. It includes a number of supply and demand incentives to basically incentivize and further investment primarily in the US, but through North America, to ensure that they can access sufficient raw materials to fund their battery market. On the left, they're more on the supply side, so that's encouraging greater levels of battery production in the US, for example. But on the right is the interesting bit for critical minerals, particularly free trade agreement countries such as Australia and Canada, as I mentioned. There'll be increasing requirement to source raw materials from FTA countries, and that means that there will be opportunities either in the form of incentives or premia on prices to be able to get enough material from those FTA countries. So that means that a project, say a nickel project in Australia, may be better placed than a nickel project elsewhere in the world because it can access some of those IRA incentives. And that's really the crux of where some of the opportunities are for Australia. And this really nicely shows how quickly things have changed since the IRA was announced in August last year. The red line is the US battery pipeline, and it's gained a lot of ground on the EU, which is a long way ahead. And now they're fairly neck and neck. But you can see that the amount of capital that's been diverted into the US market since that was announced, and how monumental it really is for the future of the battery industry. This is probably going to be one of the biggest changes in the structure of the industry almost in our lifetimes, and the way in which it plays out is critical for all of us in this room and really the global battery industry. And that's why we're seeing the automakers get increasingly involved in the battery supply chain. The automakers in the past have, if they need more tires, they order more tires. If they need more bonnets, they order more bonnets. They can't just order more lithium because it doesn't exist. It's in the ground, but as I said earlier on, it takes a long time to get out the ground and get into their battery. So that's why they're making sure that they either invest directly in battery projects or as part of joint venture agreements to ensure that they've got access to everything they need for that huge amount of growth that I showed earlier on. That's particularly the case in North America, as you can see, but most of the major regions, the automotive companies are increasingly moving upstream, whether that's to batteries or even all the way up to the mine, to make sure that they've got access to those units going forwards. And I'll just highlight this again because it's a really key point. We call it the raw material disconnect. There's a lot of talk about gigafactories and downstream investment, but if there's not enough raw materials coming out in the right form, into the right markets, then all of that talk about EV adoption and battery growth won't happen. And I'm not sure whether this graphic will work. It will. Excellent. So just really to hammer home the point, here you can see that a fairly significant part of a EV cost comes from the battery. And most of that is the cell. And then on the right-hand side, the bill of materials, that's all the raw materials and everything else. You can see how critical that is to the cost of these vehicles as well. So it's not just a matter of getting access to the units, it's actually having a huge impact on the cost competitiveness of these vehicles as well. And that's why the volatility in prices that we've seen for, say, lithium in the last couple of years and other minerals has a big knock-on effect into the competitiveness of various battery chemistries and ultimately the individual car companies and the models that they're putting out onto the roads. And now, just to wrap up, where are the opportunities here? I'll talk kind of more nationally rather than within Queensland, but there are, of course, opportunities in all the different states and territories too. On the left, you can see kind of where we sit at the raw material end of things. We're a major lithium producer, of course, but we're still quite a long way behind when it comes to, say, nickel and cobalt and other raw materials. Nickel, we've got the second largest global reserves, but we're really not leaning into that as much as we maybe could, and potentially those Inflation Reduction Act incentives could support that. But lithium really is the opportunity at the moment in the upstream, but companies have struggled to go that next step down into refining, into lithium carbonate, lithium hydroxide. The technical process is complicated, and even the experienced producers have struggled with that. And then production cost is another barrier. We struggle to compete with Asian labor costs, with Asian build costs. But at the same time, our geopolitical position may kind of offset some of that disadvantage. And of course, a very stable and well-respected investment environment globally, particularly at the mining level. I think all of those things are supportive, even if production cost maybe isn't. As I mentioned earlier on, the policy developments we're seeing, particularly in the US, will help FTA countries such as Australia, and that will ultimately have knock-on effects into the upstream and the development of projects here. And how far we go down the supply chain is the age-old question in Australia. I think it's softly. I don't think we can jump straight down into battery and EV production, but we've got a very strong raw materials industry to base ourselves off. We've got a skilled workforce, and it's deciding how far to go downstream, but there certainly are downstream opportunities, probably at least into the midstream of the industry, and that will open up new high-tech industries, other job opportunities, as Stephen mentioned earlier on, kind of that multiplier effect. But certainly we've got a very good base to go off, And now it's just identifying where the opportunities are to move further downstream. And with that, thank you very much.
You're not going to get away that quickly. Do we have any questions? Oh, yes, Stephen's keen. Do we have... There we go.
Stephen Grocott, Queensland Pacific Metals. Thanks, Harry. Firstly, the free plug. QPM are benchmark members, and I commend what your organisation does. You do a great job. I've got an ESG question for you. Just using the simple global stats, about 7% of the world's nickel for the battery sector comes out of the Ramu nickel refinery in Papua New Guinea, where they dispose of their tailings in the ocean. So if your EV is driving around with a battery pack with nickel from there, it's actually driving on 5 tonnes of tailings disposed in the ocean and untreated effluent. All the burgeoning nickel growth in Indonesia is primarily through plants which build tailings dams, which are illegal in most parts of the world, and dispose of untreated effluent. The carbon intensity is about 3 times the global average. Their mining practices, they don't have the rehab, they displace traditional owners, etc., etc., etc. At the moment, all nickel goes into a bucket called China and gets distributed. In the future, do you see that ESG is actually going to make a difference, as opposed to all of these glorious and wonderful companies saying that they're going to do the right thing?
That's a pretty one for you, Harry.
Ripple of applause. Thanks, Stephen. Excellent question. It's probably the first presentation I've done in a long time where I haven't talked about ESG, actually, so I probably should have expected the question. Before I get into Indonesia, which I love talking about, actually, it's probably what I present on more than anything else, so you've asked the right question. ESG, yes, it's probably not having a huge tangible effect at the moment, but I think it's increasingly being considered in investment decisions. We're seeing strategy of the downstream, particularly look upstream into specifically only projects that are kind of ESG compliant, or at least are communicating about it in the right way. We've got a sustainability team that's growing by the day at Benchmark, and it's becoming an increasingly important part of our overall portfolio of the business, and it's not really something that I've looked at in a huge amount of detail in the past, kind of with my market hat on, but it's something that we can't really ignore anymore, and I'm having to get up to speed with life cycle assessments like you've mentioned earlier on, and there's a lot, and we're doing a lot to cover ESG across the markets that we do, and we do quarterly reporting on all of those markets. In terms of Indonesia, I was there earlier this year doing some site visits, looking at some of the new HPAL capacity in Indonesia. It often gets the dirty nickel term, which I really dislike, because there's a broad spectrum of ESG compliance in Indonesia. Some are very good, and yes, there's some with a huge amount of issues that need to be overcome. And that's where we're potentially seeing bifurcation in the market. Those units that are ESG compliant and hit global standards will be able to serve Western OEMs. Ford, VW, other midstream companies have invested in Indonesia already, and they won't accept low levels of ESG compliance, so that's kind of one bucket. And then there's everything else, which is likely to continue going into China. On the tailings point, I think you just probably need to be careful. I'm sure you know the details about tailings dams versus dry stack and kind of the pros and cons of each. I think the PNG benefit from different bathymetry, that they can dispose of tailings in in an easier fashion than Indonesia, which is environmentally very sensitive and doesn't have the ocean depth that they have in PNG, but I'm not a specialist on that. But it's been banned in Indonesia for a reason, and that's why they're looking at the dry stack process, at least for HPAL. And that has benefits because you're not creating new levels of deforestation for land clearing of tailings dams, and you can refill X pits. There's a lot of detail in that. I'm happy to have a chat to you later on about it. But I think the main takeaway really is there's a spectrum of ESG compliance in Indonesia, and that's when you need to start looking at the detail of individual producers.
Do we have any other questions? Getting my steps up.
Hi, Bill McPhee from BASF. Touching on the ESG question and your demand slide there, I mean, one way of achieving ESG is to use a lot less. And I'm sure those demand slides have an average battery assumption there. And also the fact that you didn't show the capacity needed to fill that. I don't believe there's enough mines globally, especially as we go out, that could ever meet that demand. So what sort of risk do you put into your investment thesis around people, A, using cars less because a lot of people are working from home, B, people needing cars with range of arguably 50 kilometres instead of 400. And when things cost a lot, people typically pick the cheaper option. And wouldn't that have a bigger effect on ESG practically than some of the other ideas?
Yes, it's a good point, and it's something we take into account in our demand view. So that does take into account some of those themes that you talked about. We certainly don't think there's enough raw materials in the long-term view to serve those demand numbers. I think that's clear. We're foreseeing fairly substantial deficits come the 2030s in most of the markets that we cover, even earlier for some. And we also have got, for our sustainability work, we've got a fairly comprehensive view on recycling as well, and that's increasingly a bigger part of the market. So it might be 10-20% of nickel and cobalt going forwards, even higher. It's going to be harder for lithium, of course, but hopefully that answers your question. I'm happy to have a chat about it later on. But yeah, we're taking into account kind of the themes about car use, but the demand, I think, is clear, even if you it doesn't move the dial a huge amount.
Okay, just taking away the deficit and demand profile and going back to Stephen's question, do you think that the battery passports or material passports are going to be playing a factor in consumer choices? I know as a new EV driver, there was no level of Mercedes that could tell me the provenance of any of the cathode materials in my battery, and I'm actually a service provider to Mercedes for due diligence for material supply, that, as you were mentioning at the beginning, how they want to get into mining space. So is this something that we should push for consumers?
I think it will start to have an impact, but based on the previous question, I think people often just fall back on the cost of the EV. Particularly at the moment, there's not a huge amount of EV availability at the moment, particularly in Australia. We are seeing more and more models available and variety of models, but compared to Europe and the US, we're a long way behind in terms of what vehicles we can get access to, and that ultimately affects the cost competitiveness when you go to buy an EV. So I think at the moment, most people are looking at cost and range, and yeah, most people don't need 4, 5, 600 Ks of range, but that's what people think they need, whereas most of us don't drive more than 50, 100 Ks in an average journey. So I think those kind of policy drivers are important to improve the transparency of the whole supply chain and ensure that the car companies are sourcing responsibly. But whether it starts to have an impact on consumers such as ourselves in the short term, I'm not so sure.
Okay.